Jody's here. My name is Marcia Doty. I'm one of the bookends. And I'd like to thank Zavier for facilitating the Tuesday night lecture series, My Story. Our second talk tonight is with John Wilcock. I'm sure you're going to find this very interesting. I read his 30-second bio and I wanted to keep going and going and going. So, Zavier, since the day we opened in December, has been our biggest champion. He has come up with some very good ideas, and Tuesday night lecture series is one of them. And I'd like to thank him very much for facilitating this, and for John, thank you for coming tonight.
Thanks, Marcia.
Okay.
Well, so I'm going to give a little introduction. John and I go back to 1969, although we only met about a couple of years ago. I was an aspiring underground cartoonist. I was 15 years old. I had my first comics printed in the East Village Other, which was a New York underground newspaper. And only recently, when I went back to that issue that I still had until I sold it on eBay recently, I realized that John's column, Other Scenes, was in that first issue that I had been printed. And I'd known the name for years, and was amazed when our friend David told me, hey, do you know John Wilcock is in town, living actually right around the corner from me. So it's quite interesting. And John gave me his autobiography, Manhattan Memories, and I've been going through it, and I'm just amazed. It would be like if there was a fly on the wall during the 1950s beatnik scene, the beginning of the Village Voice, all that kind of creativity in that period, and jazz, and the hippie scene, and a fly on the wall with a steno pad, and that was John. So really, as you'll find out, he interacted with, as I put it in the description, the greatest minds of his generation. It's really true, I think. And I brought, these are some of John's papers. Of course, Other Scenes was his famous underground newspaper. And I think it characterizes John that this special issue cost 25 cents. Most of it consists of blank pages. Do not waste your money buying it unless you want a collector's item or you're planning to enter our do-it-yourself newspaper contest. First prize, $250. So John's always been something of a prankster. He's a guy who sort of looks at things in a different way, and he kind of puts a new spin on a lot of things that we all just look at and take for granted. And so, as I say, here's the explanation, and the rest is just blank. So it might have been a way to save money on staffing that issue, but I think it's, as I say, really characteristic of this peculiar genius of John Wilcock. And then the magazine turned into a magazine from a tabloid. And then John, being the traveler he is, that he'll tell you about, he also would, in England, he would kind of partner with Oz, right?
Richard Neville from Australia.
Oh, Australia, okay,
Right.
yeah. And so then there's Japanese issues, and there's some different partnerships.
Right.
So I'm going to turn it over to John. I'm going to try to shut up, but I'll kind of prod him a little bit. And so, John Wilcock, please. This is your life.
Well, that book, which was actually my autobiography, Manhattan Memories, although it covers a lot of things apart from Manhattan. It was about 20 years ago I tried to get a publisher, and absolutely nobody would publish it. And they all told me that it was not a real autobiography, they said. A real autobiography in those days being defined by Angela's Ashes, which was a tale of somebody's incredibly terrible childhood, what a miserable time they had, how they worked their way through it and became successful, and all the autobiographies were supposed to be like this. Well, I've always avoided autobiographies that deal with childhood because I think they're extremely boring. And my personal life, I thought, began when I got to New York, when I was about 20. But I do have to begin before that, because most of the things that happened to me in my teens were things that taught me to be a writer. And I left boarding school at 16, and I went on to the Sheffield Telegraph, which is, I think Sheffield is probably the 5th largest city in England, and has always been famous for steel, and is surrounded by coal mining places and so on. And a cub reporter in those days really had to do all the very boring chores, like, for example, I would have to go to the funerals of the local big shop businessmen and collect business cards at the door, turn them over to the paper so that the next day all these people could be recorded as having duly turned up at the funeral. And eventually I graduated to writing stuff, and one of the first stories I wrote, I took to the news editor very proudly, and he looked at it and he asked me a question, and I couldn't answer it. And he handed the story back. He said, "Never raise questions you can't answer." And that's something I've taught hundreds of writers since, probably, and still lives with me today. When you're writing something, there are a lot of questions come up, but you don't raise them. You very carefully avoid them, avoid mentioning them in the story. Anyway, I worked for the Sheffield Telegraph for a while, and then in England, every journalist's aim is to go and work for Fleet Street, go and work for one of the London papers with huge circulations that are distributed all over the country. And the only way to get there, basically, if you weren't hired immediately, was to go and work in one of the district offices. And I was assigned to Newcastle on Tyne in the northeast of England, and being the youngest person in the bureau, I was constantly made to get drunk so they would laugh at me, and they weren't very pleasant days, but they did teach me the rudiments of journalism. And after a while, I managed to persuade the Daily Mirror, which at that time was probably the biggest paper in the world. It had 4 million circulation. And they hired me to run the Sheffield office. Sheffield is where I was born, so I was somewhat familiar with it. And running a district office meant that you were responsible for a fairly large area. In my case, it would have been all of South Yorkshire and the adjoining counties, Lancashire and Derbyshire. And the thing is that you had to know everything that happened in that area. You had to read all the local papers, and you had to be really up to date and not miss anything. And every morning at 10 o'clock I had to call London and tell them the stories I was working on for the day. And they in turn would hear from all the other district officers, and at 11 o'clock they would hold their conference and decide what stories were going into the paper that day. The deadline was at night because the trains that left for all over the country had to be caught with the paper. Everything had to be in and dealt with before then. The London tabloids before Murdoch were really very interesting. I'm a big fan of tabloids. Murdoch basically brought them all down, very down market, and put nudes in them and made them, in essence, vulgar. But when I worked for the Mirror, tabloids still meant something. I mean, they would take maybe a government white paper about education or something that was necessary for people to know, and they would condense it into 8 very succinct paragraphs telling you the whole story. A story that the Times would take like 8 columns to tell. So I learned to write very tight and short, and Lord Northcliffe, who started the Daily Mail, is famous for having said that a good reporter can travel around London on the top of a double-decker bus and come back with a page-1 story. So that was the kind of thing you were aiming at, you know, page-1 stories. If you could transcend your area with a story that made the national papers and, you know, everybody read it, then that was success. Anyway, after a while, I was obviously anxious to get to London, and I was still young, probably in my late teens. No job was available in London, and so I just happened to read Time magazine with a cover story about Canada. And Canada, I thought to myself, wow, this is English, but it's really American, so I should be able to cope with this. And I found out that if I applied immediately, I could get an assisted airline ticket. I think I had to pay about £17, which at the time would have been 50, 60 bucks. And they would fly me to Toronto, and all I had to do was agree to not to work in Toronto and hang out there for a couple of years. So I arrived in Toronto, immediately headed for this island just off downtown Toronto in Lake Ontario, where they have these huge Victorian wooden houses with balconies, very great. And one of the smart things about Canada is they have all the national holidays on Fridays or Mondays, which gives everybody 3-day weekends, so that was great. And so I went to live on the island, and I got a job in the Toronto Greater Credit Bureau as a typist. And there was an island. I lived on a thing called Centre Island, but there were a lot of little islands, and one of them was called Donut Island. It had a hole in it. And there was a place called Long Pond. So I thought, well, I'll write for the paper and I'll do a column called Long Ponderings. What can I do with Donut Island? And of course it didn't take long to think of the Lifesaver Company. So I wrote to Lifesaver and I said, look, there's this island with a hole in the centre. I'll call it Lifesaver Island in my column if you'll send me a lot of lifesavers, which I'll give out Albert Curry. So I did. And hardly had I got that out of the way when I got a job in the night editor of the UPI Bureau, which was British United Press at the time, BUP. And my duty in the BUP office was to take the news wire that came clanking in on the teletype, read it, and type it to go out to radio stations. And you might think, well, why do they need anything different for radio stations? But what I was taught was that if you're writing for radio stations, you never put a name at the beginning of a sentence because that's lost, people don't hear it. So you rephrase the thing so it's conversational and the names come further down. So that was an interesting thing to learn. And so I was working away one night, and I was the totally alone guy at night and looking after the bureau. And this Canadian novelist called Hugh Garner came toddling in and said, you've got to come with me to a press conference that Jack Kent Cooke is giving. He's bought a bunch of magazines and he wants to announce it. This is a genuine story and you must close the office and come with me. Well, I knew a bit about Jack Kent Cooke. He was a legendary figure already. He was about 30 years old and he had determined that he was going to be a millionaire before he was 35. And one of the things that he did was he went to Roy Thompson, who was a local press mogul, who later bought the London Sunday Times, Roy Thompson. And he said to Thompson, you know that radio station of yours, CKY, well, I could make it a real money maker. And Thompson was very suspicious and said, well, I've never done anything like this before. And Cooke said, oh, sure, yeah, I've done lots of radio stations. Total lie, he'd never been in a radio station in his life. So he took over CKY, and to Thompson and everybody's astonishment, made it the most successful station in Toronto, and certainly the richest. And what he did was a very simple thing. In Canadian radio in those days was very sort of easygoing and lackluster, and a program would end and they'd dither about a bit and then a new program would start. Cooke abolished all those bits of wasted time, tightened the thing up so there was no pause between one program and the next, gained a lot of hours out of this of the day, sold it all for very heavy advertising. So it was already a success in a way. I went to the press conference, I closed the office. Cooke was very impressed with me because I'd worked for Fleet Street Papers and he was madly in love with publishing already. He just bought all these magazines. So he gave me a job on a magazine called Saturday Night, which was a weekly. And I started doing short profiles of, say, the CEO of Canada's Procter & Gamble company, things like that. And I did this for a while, and then I heard about a job going in Nassau, the island of Nassau, in the Nassau Guardian. So I packed up my job and I went to Nassau, which I soon found was a big, big mistake. And after about a month with working in this decrepit office in which land crabs would be crawling across the floor, across our feet all the time, I went back to Toronto, was walking in the main streets, bumped into Jack Kent Cooke. He said, oh, you're back. He said, are you taking up your old job? I said, well, no, actually, it's been filled. He said, well, you must go and work for my other magazine, Liberty. And I said, well, I don't think I could do that, Jack, because, you know, it's long stuff, and I'm not writing long pieces like a period magazine. No, you must go and see this editor, Frank Rasky, at Liberty Magazine. So I went to Liberty, and it was a funny interview because I was trying to persuade the editor I couldn't do this kind of thing, and he had been instructed by Cook to hire me, which of course he did. So I persuaded, so I started work there, and they sent me up to Ottawa to interview a best-selling author called Nicholas Montserrat, who'd just written a book called The Cruel Sea. And I persuaded Canadian National to give me a trip across Canada, free on the train, and I persuaded Canadian Pacific to give me a trip back. And then I learned about New York. I went on one of these 3-day weekends down to New York, and of course fell madly in love with New York. Realized I really had to go to New York. Went in to see Cook, and he said, why are you always running away? He said, why don't you stay here and grow with the organization? So it turned out to be rather an odd thing to say, because he was such an influential guy that eventually he went to Washington, had a lot of political contacts, bought the Washington Redskins of it. He had owned the Toronto Maple Leafs in Canada, that ice hockey club. He bought the Washington Redskins. He became a big figure with a lot of political influence in Washington. And somehow, and I've never heard of anybody else who ever did it, persuaded the US to give him a retroactive citizenship. So in actual fact, although he hadn't known it, he was actually an American citizen in Canada when he was persuading me to stay and grow with the organization. Anyway, so I got to New York, and I headed for Greenwich Village, you know, like a lemming. Immediately I needed Greenwich Village because this is where all the writers and artists were. And I thought, this is great, I'm going to be able to find out where all the parties are and meet all these artists and writers. To my astonishment, the only paper there was called The Villager, and it used to cover like Women's Institute meetings and garden clubs and other exciting things like that. Had a columnist called Scoopy Mew, who was a cat. And I thought, well, you know, this place really needs a paper. So I went to a local bookstore. This is about my 3rd day there in Sheridan Square. And I put a notice up asking if anybody would like to help start a newspaper in Greenwich Village. And quite a lot of people actually replied, but including Ed Fancher, who was a psychologist, and Dan Wolf, who worked for the Turkish Information Office. He was a very serious man. The only joke he ever told me in his life was that when it came Thanksgiving, the Turkish Information Office got more clippings than all the rest of the year put together because they all had turkey in them. Anyway, so I hung up I rented this apartment in the village, and it was on the ground floor, and it was very near the sidewalk, only the distance from me to that bench where there were railings on the sidewalk. And I hung up a hammock on the railings, and of course about 2 out of every 3 people who came by would make some comment. So I got to know a few people that way. And I didn't have any money, but I managed to get a job on a magazine called Pageant, which was run by a very bright editor called Harry Shevelson. He died in a plane crash 2 years later. And he had a very original idea about magazines. He thought that subscriptions told you nothing. What told you was if you had the cover lines on the magazine, and the people bought more of that magazine than the previous month. And so there were 3 cover lines on every magazine, and he insisted that one of them always had to have the word sex in it. And so that apparently worked. And he used to do weird stories, like, for example, he often wondered, how competent are you when you get drunk? So he ordered in a case of scotch, and everybody in the office spent the day getting drunk, and he would measure them on tasks all through the day and get a story out of that. And another thing, oh, I forgot to tell you that one of the jobs I had done while I was working for Liberty in Canada was I was labelled the crackpot editor. And I had a column every month with a picture, and I always had to do something crazy, like, for example, I fed the lions in the Toronto Zoo, and I went out with the window cleaners and cleaned a window hanging out of the 29th story with straps around me. And one day he gave me a $100 bill and said, try and get through the day without breaking that, but buy everything you can. So of course I went to all the kind of places that wouldn't want to give me any change. I usually got away with it, so that I got 3 columns out of that, 3 monthly columns. So anyway, I did this, I worked for Pageant, and then these people I had met, Ed Fancher and Dan Wolfe, I met them in a bar, and they got some money from somewhere, and they were going to start a paper. And Dan's girlfriend, Rona, was a friend of Norman Mailer, and so she had persuaded him to write a column for the paper. He also actually provided the name, the Village Voice. We all sat down and wrote names on pads, and that was the one that was agreed that would be accepted. So anyway, in the meantime, Frank Rasky, back at Liberty in Toronto, had decided, well, now that I'm in New York, I should really do some stories for Liberty from New York. And first of all, he sent me out to the coast to interview Rock Hudson and Milton Berle, and then back in New York to see Leonard Bernstein, and then to go on interview Steve Allen, and then Marlene Dietrich. I took an assistant with me to take notes when I saw Marlene Dietrich. She lived in an apartment on Park Avenue, and the whole apartment, there were pictures on the wall, signed pictures from people like Hemingway and so on, who were all famous friends of hers and who she respected greatly. And the reason why we did the story was that NBC had hired her to give little 10-minute talks, giving advice to people who called in or wrote into NBC. And while we were there, it was kind of an interesting interview. And as we were about to leave, we were in the lobby and we were putting on our coats. And this woman who came with me to take notes said, Miss Dietrich, could I ask you a question? And she said, of course, dear, go ahead. So she said, well, I am having a lot of trouble with my boyfriend because he wants me to get married, but I really want to have a career, and I can't decide what to do. And Dietrich, to everybody's astonishment, said, get married, dear. A career is no help to you when later on in life and nobody wants to hire you, you'll want to have children, which was sort of interesting advice. Anyway, so I went back to the office.
Pre-feminist.
Sorry?
Pre-feminist.
Yes, pre-feminist. She was a very strong lady, Marlene Dietrich. Anyway, so then Rasky called up and he said, oh, I want you to go see Marilyn Monroe. And I said, oh yeah, I heard of her. She's, I've never seen the movie, but I know she's made some movies. And he said, yeah. I said, call up the press agent, and I'm sure you'll get to see Marilyn Monroe. So I called up the press agent, Frank Woodman, and these were the days when press agents worked to get you interviewed with the clients. They didn't stand in the way and try and keep you away from the clients. So I went to see Marilyn Monroe, and everybody wants to know about Marilyn Monroe. I've been asked a million times in my life about Marilyn Monroe. And what Zavier made me promise was not to pretend that, not to say that I've done this story a million times before, but to tell you as if I'd never told anybody before. So anyway, I'll start.
By the way, one thing that you say in your book, in your autobiography here, is that you talk about never really having been cowed by fame.
Oh, right, yes, yes.
And I think, I bet that really kind of ingratiated you with a lot of the famous people you met, because you weren't fawning that kind of thing.
I was never...
or deferring.
I don't know why, but maybe it's just arrogance, but I was never really bowled over by stars. I think stars, genuine stars, are very, very good at what they do. They're the best at what they do, otherwise it wouldn't be stars. But I think that what I do very well too. And I'm proud of being a journalist. I mean, a lot of people don't like journalism, but I'm proud of being a journalist. I learned my trade in the hardest possible of ways, and I went through many, many years of it. And in my lifetime, I've worked for 5 of the world's biggest daily papers, including the New York Times, 2 papers in London, Toronto Star, and the Mainichi News in Tokyo. But anyway, I went to see Marilyn Monroe, and he called me up 2 days after I'd called him and said, she's going to meet us in the lobby of the Waldorf Towers on Park Avenue. Meet me there, 2 o'clock Tuesday. So I roll up, and we both wait in the lobby, and 2 o'clock comes and there's no Marilyn. he says, I think I'd better call her sweet. I don't know why at that moment she comes out of the elevator. And she's got her hair up, but it's falling down. And she's wearing enormous sunglasses. And she's wearing a fairly cheap-looking polka-dotted white blouse and a tight skirt that comes down to 2 or 3 inches above her knees, but it's certainly not a miniskirt. And we set off. He says, can we go to Child's Restaurant on Lexington Avenue? She asked Frank. She says, I've been there before and I really like that place. And so Frank says, of course, of course. So we start walking up Lexington Avenue. And I turned to her and I said, you know, your disguise isn't doing you much good. She says, what do you mean disguise? And I said, well, everybody's sort of staring at you, you know, as if you well known, if they were familiar with you. And she said, oh, it's probably because I'm a girl. I do hope it's because I'm a girl. So that sort of turned me on. She'd already absolutely startled me, because when she turned up 10 minutes late, she said, I'm not late, am I? And we both very gallantly said, oh, no, not at all, 10 minutes. And the first thing she said in response to that was, oh, well, Sir Thomas